Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Drew, and I want to welcome you back to another episode of Learn How to See Better. It's the only podcast out there that'll actually improve your vision the longer you listen. And today, I've got a pretty unique episode that was actually fueled by something I read recently. And when I read it, I thought to myself, suffering Succotash. A little phrase from some of the cartoons I watched as a kid, some of the Looney Tunes characters, and suffering Succotash is just kind of like a way to say, wow, when I was reading this article talking about some of the personal journeys that we go on, and as you all know, a lot of times what I'm sharing is some of the things that we can do and learn while we're on our journey to enhance our joy, to enhance our progress, to enhance our perspective, right? So as we look at all these things, it's important to note kind of how everything all comes together. I think it's easy to recognize that the journey is not going to be a simple straight line. The journey is not going to be without its difficulties. But the important thing to note is to find some sort of way to keep track of your emotional state during the journey, and for a different reason than you might anticipate. Some people might say, oh, you're just watching your feelings to make sure that you're feeling good. Don't you understand that the path and the journey and the life of the entrepreneur is one that's going to be riddled with ups and downs, so you should expect disappointment and defeat and all these experiences, and I'm not here to touch on that part of it all, but what I am here to touch on is the fact that we do need to make sure that we understand and have the radar up for when we're going through certain emotions and what that's telling us. Case in point, I said suffering Succotash. Suffering being the key word. Have you ever thought or realized that you may be suffering? And suffering, I don't mean, like you're dealing with some heinous injustice that's, just plagued your very existence, but I mean actually suffering. And the way the article read was essentially saying if you're finding yourself dealing with large amounts of stress, anxiety, and overwhelm, then you are in fact suffering. And it's a different way to look at it, because I always thought, suffering is just this ongoing punishment where, you have little to no say over your experience and what you're going through. And the fact of the matter is that may be the case in the traditional sense of the word suffering, but when you look at it in this context, when you look at it as someone that's going through a process or a journey or a period of their life where they're experiencing change, they're experiencing challenge, and hopefully experiencing, some level of triumph at some point to help keep the sanity. But the fact remains that if you're just suffering, then I think it's going to be a lot more difficult for you to reach some of the accolades that you set out to do, because you're not going to be in the mental space. It's a lot more difficult to have the mental stamina of a champion when you are just stressed out, over anxious, overwhelmed, and that's something that you want to be cognizant of, because if you're not able to recognize these factors in your life and the way that they're punishing you, then typically you're not going to be as well equipped to battle these things or identify the sources of them. Maybe it's a source of, maybe there's something in your personal life going on that's a source of this stress, anxiety, overwhelm. Perhaps it's even more pinpointed than that. It might be a specific instance of something you're facing in your business where you can identify it and you just haven't addressed it yet. But it all ends up being about the same. At the end of the day, we have to be able to take note of some of the things that we're suffering from and look to identify what's causing those things. Because if we just say, oh, well, I'm just going through it. I'm just going through the paces and going through the punishment that's required to reach this goal, right? Then it's a little bit short-sighted, in my opinion, to think that it's just going to end because you've suffered long enough. And in many cases, the stress, anxiety, and overwhelm that takes place in our lives is not eradicated or eliminated until it's addressed, till it's confronted, right? So when you give it that shift in perspective, you recognize that you're in a lot more powerful position than you realize. What's the sense in suffering, especially if you're putting yourself through the suffering, right? So these are always moments that we can use to gauge our own well-being, right? Because if you look at the overall state of well-being, if you're not in a state of happiness or balance, there's probably something going on with either your, physical or mental or spiritual health, right? There's something that might be amiss with your finances or your ability to provide for others or to make ends meet, right? There could be financial stresses. And last but not least, there could be pains in the relationship arena in your life. Maybe it's a relationship with yourself. Maybe it's family members. Maybe it's your relationship with, again, yourself, I think is one of the most overlooked relationships out there. How do you talk to yourself? Would you let someone else talk to you that way? Those are the types of questions that we sometimes have to ask ourselves, because I can tell you right now, with my athletic background and having dealt with, tough, head busting coaches, that, it's like you became accustomed to being spoken to in a challenging way, right? They're trying to get the toughness out of you. So they might talk down to you to make you mad, get you agitated, and want to fight back a little bit and get that fire going in you. Okay, I get that that's a state control manipulation to be able to, get you in that fight or flight response so you can achieve the objectives athletically. But, take that and think about your everyday. Would you get up in the, first thing in the morning and start, shouting and ranting at yourself, to try and motivate for yourself for the day? I can imagine that could get a little bit sticky and a little bit difficult, because you know what? I'm the type that I don't necessarily respond well to being just yelled at and orders barked at, and everybody's a little bit different. I understand the concept of motivation. You got to get somebody under your skin to get you going, but in all reality, a lot of that ought to be able to be self-generated, as opposed to just having to take what someone else is giving you. But the point here again being that I'd like to see everyone out there listening to this empower themselves and just take stock of how you're doing. Right? Take stock of how you're doing. One of the best ways to recognize that is to just make note and be in tune with how you're feeling. And I'm not talking about, touchy-feely, mushy. I'm just talking about your overall well-being. Do you feel like you're doing okay? Right? Check on yourself and check in to make sure that you're not just punishing yourself, really, for a purpose that may not require it. You should not be suffering when you are in pursuit of success. There's going to be some difficult challenges along the way and things that will, put you through the paces. But as far as your everyday feeling, your everyday mode, your everyday mindset, mentality should not be overwhelmed with stress, anxiety, and other frustrations. That literally is suffering. And I think that's one of the things that we all ought to have the clarity of thought to recognize is not a necessary factor as we look to achieve our goals. So it's just something to keep in mind. So if you find yourself detecting, using your little spider sense or sixth sense or intuition or whatever you want to call it, something that's making you feel pretty negative, it's a great opportunity to say, okay, what could possibly be making me feel this way? What am I doing in my world that creates these feelings? And if you feel like the things that are creating that feeling are external, then identify what they are. If you feel that they're internal, address that as well. But do your best to identify where the feelings are coming from, because you could feel them. Something's not right, and you too could have the opportunity to make great strides in your own success by sometimes just getting out of your own way, right? There's an old quote that's saying, worrying actually works, right? Worrying, W-O-R-R-Y, to worry, right? Don't be a worrywart. They say worrying actually works because 90% of the things that we worry about don't come true. So that's one unique way to look at it. If you find yourself constantly preoccupied with some sort of outcome that's undesirable, which is really the definition of anxiety as opposed to fear. Fear is when fear is like when you're nervous about the future and it's real. Anxiety is apprehension about the future for something that's not real, right? Okay, we're all gonna, cease to breathe life, to breathe air one day. That could be a real fear if that gets you worked up. But, the boogeyman crawling out of your bed or the closet to come and get you, that's probably not a real fear. So there may be anxiety around it, a negative feeling that's associated with something that's not real in the future, which is a lot different than real fear. Those negative feelings that are tied to something very real, right? Like that vicious barking dog that looks like it's going to take your head off because it's off a leash and you're scared. Okay, that might be a reason for fear. But other instances, we may just have a little bit of anxiety over, and we have to be able to recognize those, because there are a lot of loud messages in the world today, and we have to be able to discern those as clearly as we can. And a lot of that's going to be driven by our perceptual filters, and the way that we perceive the world and perceive our own experience is going to dictate a lot of our happiness in and of itself. So if you're not feeling happy, there's probably something behind that, and you need to look beyond the surface to find out what it is. So that's just a spontaneous tip that I wanted to share from a great article that I read this morning. I thought, wow, suffering succotash. So many of us are suffering, and it's by some of our own means, and we don't realize it. We don't understand it, and we haven't figured out or put the pieces together as to what's driving that stress, anxiety, and overwhelm. And sometimes it may be a little bit tricky to identify that, but if you can feel it, then it's there. Then try a little bit harder, because awareness is the first step towards change. And once you recognize there is something there, then that's when you can do something proactive about it. So until next time, I just want to thank you all for tuning in and looking at ways that you all can learn how to see better. Thanks. Talk to you all again soon.